the man who was going to die tomorrow, was the calmest person in the building. That was what unsettled Officer Rivera most. Not the execution itself, not the paperwork, not the protocol he had rehearsed a dozen times in training, but never yet performed in reality. It was the stillness of the man in cell block D, a stillness so complete and so deliberate that it felt less like peace and more like something that had been built, brick by careful brick, over a very long time. Daniel Colt sat on the edge of his prison cot, with his back straight and his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes fixed on the middle distance between himself and the concrete wall across from him. He had been sitting that way since lights out. He had not paced. He had not wept. He had not pressed his face to the bars and called out to anyone. He had simply sat, as still as something carved, breathing slowly in the dark. Rivera paused outside the cell for the third time that night, unable to explain to himself why he kept returning. The other guards had told him it was a habit you had to break early, the habit of watching them too closely on the last night. It did something to you, they said. It got inside you and stayed. But Rivera couldn't stop. Ward, he said softly, using the identifier from the file even though it felt wrong. You need anything? Daniel looked up. His eyes, dark-ringed from years of poor sleep but still sharp and present, found Rivera's through the bars with an immediacy that said he had been aware of the officer standing there long before Rivera had spoken. Just the one thing, Daniel said. His voice was quiet and even. And I already asked. Rivera nodded. He knew. Every officer on the block knew, because word like that traveled faster than anything else inside these walls. Daniel Colt's last request before execution was not food, not a phone call, not a letter, not a prayer with the chaplain. It was a dog. His retired K-9 partner, a Belgian Malinois named Atlas, who had worked beside him for 10 years and had been present on the night that destroyed his life. The request had puzzled people. It had unsettled people. A few had laughed, though not where Daniel could hear them. What kind of man, hours from death, asks for a dog? Rivera had been thinking about that question since the request was approved 2 days earlier. And standing outside the cell now, watching Daniel Colt sit with that impossible stillness, he thought he was beginning to understand. A dog was the only thing in the world that had never decided anything about Daniel Colt, never read a headline about him, never sat in a jury box, never signed a verdict, never believed or disbelieved a single word anyone had said. A dog had simply known him, directly and completely, the way animals know the people they love, through proximity and time and the accumulation of 10,000 ordinary moments. Daniel wasn't asking for comfort. He was asking for the only witness who had been there and had never lied. Rivera stood at the cell door a moment longer. Then he said, very quietly, "He arrives at 7. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Something moved through his expression, too controlled to call relief, but something in that direction. "Thank you," he said. Rivera walked away down the corridor. Behind him, Daniel Colt sat back down on the edge of his cot, folded his hands, and returned to his stillness. Outside, somewhere in the dark city, a black transport vehicle was already being prepared. And inside a kennel, in a facility across town, a Belgian Malinois with a silver muzzle and amber eyes lifted his head from sleep. ears rotating toward a sound no human in the building could hear, and waited. To understand what happened the morning Atlas walked into that holding room, you have to go back 17 years. You have to go back to a condemned building on the east side of the city on a rainy November night when a 24-year-old rookie officer named Daniel Colt responded to a call about suspicious activity and found, chained to a radiator in a room that smelled of mold and old water, a Belgian Malinois puppy who should not have been alive. The dog was perhaps 8 months old. His ribs were visible beneath skin that stretched too tightly over his frame. There was a gash above his left ear, partially healed and badly so. When Daniel's flashlight found him, the puppy pressed himself as flat against the floor as his body allowed, trembling in a continuous fine vibration that didn't stop when Daniel crouched down, didn't stop when Daniel spoke softly, didn't stop for a very long time. Daniel did not reach for the dog. He did not try to approach. He simply sat down cross-legged on that dirty floor, close enough for the puppy to smell him, far enough not to crowd him. And he talked. He talked about nothing. He talked about the rain coming through the broken windows and the way the city smelled after a week of wet weather and the particular annoyance of the department's parking lot, which flooded every time the storm drains backed up. He talked in the low, even, unhurried voice he had developed without realizing it. The voice that came naturally in situations where alarm would make things worse. He talked for 2 hours. Sometime around midnight, the trembling eased. The puppy's ears, pinned flat since Daniel had entered, lifted slightly. His eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance in the unfocused way of an animal in shock, began to track Daniel's face. And then, slowly, with the cautious deliberateness of a creature making a decision of enormous consequence, the puppy crawled forward 6 inches on his belly and rested his chin on Daniel's knee. Daniel sat perfectly still. He kept talking, softer now. His hand, resting on his own knee, didn't move. He let the weight of the dog's chin sit there for a long time before he very slowly turned his palm upward. The puppy sniffed it. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than lungs, he closed his eyes. Daniel named him Atlas because he had already survived the world pressing down on him, and he was still here. The road from that condemned building to the canine unit was not smooth or quick. Atlas required months of rehabilitation before formal training could begin. He flinched at car engines. He panicked in elevators. He struggled with commands in environments with too much noise or too many people. Twice in the early months, training supervisors recommended washing him out of the program entirely, citing his instability and the resources required to bring him up to standard. Twice, Daniel argued to keep him. He made those arguments with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. He laid out the data. Atlas's tracking scores in controlled environments were exceptional. His scent discrimination was remarkable, even undertrained. His attunement to human emotional states was unusual enough that the program's behavioral consultant had flagged it as notable. The instability was environmental, not constitutional. It was the product of early trauma, not fundamental limitation. The supervisors were skeptical. Daniel was patient. He asked for more time and used every hour of it. There was a morning in month 5 that Daniel remembered for the rest of his life. They were in the training field before sunrise, working a simple tracking exercise, and Atlas had been struggling, getting distracted, losing the scent line, circling back on himself in the frustrated pattern Daniel recognized as the edge of shutdown. Daniel stopped the exercise. He sat down on the damp grass. Atlas came to him immediately, pressing against his side, and Daniel sat there for 15 minutes, saying nothing. One hand resting on the dog's back, letting him feel the steadiness he was struggling to locate inside himself. Then Daniel stood up and said, simply, "Again," and Atlas put his nose to the ground and ran the track without a single error, from start to finish, in the second fastest time the field had recorded that season. Something had shifted, not fixed, not resolved, but fundamentally reoriented, as if all the patience Daniel had poured into this animal had finally reached some critical threshold and taken root. From that morning forward, Atlas's confidence built in a curve that surprised even the people who had wanted to quit on him. By graduation, his scores in scent identification and suspect tracking were the highest in his class. The same supervisors who had recommended washing him out 2 months earlier shook Daniel's hand and said they had been wrong. What made Atlas extraordinary was not just the nose. Though that was extraordinary, it was the attunement. He read Daniel the way some people read music, intuitively, in real time, always one beat ahead. Daniel's tension in a building became Atlas's high alert before any command was given. Daniel's calm became Atlas's ease. They operated not as handler and working animal, but as a single organism, moving through the world on 4 legs and 2, sharing a sensory field and a purpose. In their first year as a team, they worked 17 narcotics cases. They found a missing 7-year-old girl buried under debris from a building collapse, alive, because Atlas refused to leave a section of rubble that every other search team had cleared. They tracked a wanted fugitive through 30 miles of dense woodland in the middle of winter. They became, in the quiet language of the precinct, something close to legendary. Daniel had no family to speak of. His parents were gone. A marriage had come and dissolved when his wife found she could not compete with a job that owned him completely, and she had been right to leave, though it had hurt them both. He had good friends, the kind you call in genuine emergencies but don't see on Tuesday evenings. Atlas was his constant, his anchor. The reason the apartment felt like somewhere rather than just the place he slept. When colleagues asked if he loved the dog more than people, he answered without irony. Yes, he would say, and he's earned it. 17 years of partnership leaves marks in the body and the memory that don't fade cleanly. Daniel carried those marks through every year that followed. The night everything ended, through the arrest and the trial and the 3 years on death row. Through every morning he woke in a cell and rebuilt himself from the ground up before the lights came on. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution's case was built with the skill of people who understood that a fallen hero was a more compelling story than an unknown criminal. They used Daniel's reputation against him, his record of commendations and public recognition, framing the crime as a betrayal of extraordinary dimension. They put the physical evidence on a timeline that allowed no gap, no shadow, no space for doubt. The ballistics matched his weapon. His fingerprints were on the victim's clothing. His blood, from the wound he barely remembered sustaining, was on the warehouse floor beside the body. And they used Atlas, the image of the canine barking at his own handler as officers restrained them. Both became the centerpiece of the prosecution's closing argument. If the dog who had worked beside Daniel Colt for 10 years, the dog who knew him more intimately than any human being, had turned on him in that warehouse, what more did the jury need to understand about what had happened? Daniel's defense attorney argued that Atlas had been barking at the chaos, at the flood of unknown officers, at the general terror of the scene. It was a reasonable argument. It was not persuasive enough. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and returned a verdict in the early afternoon of the 9th day. Guilty. Daniel heard the word and did not react, not because he felt nothing, but because he had made a decision somewhere in the preceding 9 days that he was not going to give the courtroom the performance it seemed to be waiting for. He sat straight in his chair with his hands flat on the table, and he looked at the jury, and he thought about Atlas, about where the dog was at this exact moment, about whether Bryce Tanner understood, yet that Atlas needed 15 minutes of quiet after a hard day and didn't like the standard issue kennel blanket. He was taken from the courtroom in handcuffs. On the steps outside, the crowd had assembled the way crowds assemble for moments that feel historic. Phones raised, voices overlapping. He looked straight ahead and kept walking. The death sentence came 6 weeks later at the sentencing hearing. The victim's family had pushed for it, and the judge had agreed that the circumstances warranted it. Daniel accepted this too without visible reaction. He was taken to Lakeview Correctional Facility on a Tuesday in November, 3 years and 2 months before the morning Atlas would walk through his door. The first night was the worst, but not for the reasons people assumed. It wasn't the cell, which was small but not smaller than the spaces Daniel had entered professionally. For 17 years, it wasn't the noise, the institutional sounds of confinement that travel differently through concrete than through air. It wasn't even the weight of the verdict pressing down on him like something physical, though that weight was real. It was this. For the first time in 10 years, he had no idea where Atlas was. He sat on the cot in the dark and ran through the practical knowledge the way you run your tongue over a broken tooth, returning to it not because it helps, but because the tongue has no other destination. Did Bryce know about the itching ear after rain? Did Bryce know about the thing Atlas did when he was anxious? The way he'd circle twice and then sit with his back against the nearest solid object. Did Bryce know that Atlas needed to be able to see a person he trusted from wherever he was sleeping? That he didn't settle fully unless he could locate someone in the room? Daniel sat with those questions until the grey pre-dawn light began in the high window. Then he lay down without removing his shoes, and he made himself a promise so quiet it barely qualified as a thought. Stay present. Stay sharp. Stay alive. He needs you to get out. By the second week, he understood the architecture of death row. He had studied prison sociology professionally, from the outside, with the clean analytical distance of someone who processes information about confined populations without living inside one. Now he was inside, and the education was entirely different. Death row at Lakeview held approximately 40 men. What surprised Daniel was not the aggression he had expected, but the quiet, a strange, stripped-down quiet that he came to understand as the sound of men who had been told with legal finality that they were going to die and had, over varying periods of time, shed the performance of bravado that characterized general population. What remained was something more essential and considerably harder to read. He was identified immediately as former law enforcement. There was no hiding it, and no point trying. For the first several days, the other inmates watched him with the specific wariness reserved for people who exist in paradoxical categories. He was one of them, and he was one of the people who had made them what they were. He didn't try to explain or argue this. He kept to his pace, maintained the posture his father had taught him. For moments when everything around you is chaos and you need your own spine to be the only steady thing in the room. And he observed. What he observed, carefully and over time, was that the men around him sorted themselves not by what they had done, but by how they handled what was happening to them now. Some had collapsed inward. Some had hardened into brittleness that would eventually crack. And a few, a surprising few, had found something he could only describe as dignity. Not happiness, not peace, but a refusal to let the circumstances dictate who they were inside them. He decided, in the methodical way he had always made decisions, to be one of the few. By the end of the first month, he had established a routine and was holding to it with the discipline of someone who understands that structure is not comfort, but survival. He woke before the block lights at 4:30 in the morning, using the grey light from the high window as his alarm. The first hour he spent lying still, working the memory of the warehouse night, the way a craftsman works a piece of difficult material, carefully, without forcing, attending to what was genuinely there rather than what the mind wanted to supply. He knew the memory existed. The blow to his skull had disrupted it, scattered it into fragments that wouldn't cohere. But the fragments were real. He had confirmed this early. He wasn't inventing them. They were there, waiting for the right conditions to reassemble, and his job was to create those conditions without the pressure that caused memory to collapse and fabricate. He approached it like casework. He noted what he could confirm. He marked what was uncertain. He held the incomplete picture with the discipline of an investigator who has learned that partial evidence is still evidence, and that the goal is not to force the pieces into a shape, but to let the real shape reveal itself. After the memory hour came physical exercise. He had no equipment and limited yard access, but he had the cell's dimensions and 17 years of physical discipline to work with. Push-ups, pull-ups using the cell door frame, static holds, core work. He had learned that the body and the mind were not separate systems. When one deteriorated, the other followed. He was not going to let either deteriorate. Then came the reading. His attorney, a civil rights lawyer named Marcus Fenn, who had taken the case pro bono after the original public defender exhausted the standard routes, had arranged a standing library order. Daniel's list was specific and deliberate. Legal texts, forensic science manuals, wrongful conviction case studies, criminal procedure guides. He read them with a highlighter and a notepad, building a second education in the precise mechanics of how innocent people ended up where he was and how they had gotten out. He was not reading for comfort. He was reading for the seam. Every wrongful conviction had one. The place where the construction showed, where the human beings who had built it had left traces of themselves in the architecture. He was going to find it. It might take years, he was going to find it. The man in the adjacent cell was named Raymond Okafor, a former accountant, 53 years old, 6 years into a death sentence that his appeals attorney had been contesting on forensic grounds since year 2. He was soft-spoken and possessed of a mathematical precision in his thinking that Daniel recognized within the first real conversation they had, conducted in the way of adjacent cells, voices directed at concrete that carried sound better than expected. "You're reading the Strickland cases," Raymond said one evening. It was not a question. Daniel paused. "How do you know?" "I track library requests. Helps me understand people." They talked that night for 2 hours. Raymond described his own case with the clean, unsentimental precision of someone who had processed his situation into something he could examine without being consumed by it. Daniel listened more than he spoke, which was unusual for him. He was recalibrating, learning the particular intelligence of a man who had survived 6 years of this and remained, as far as Daniel could determine, entirely intact. "The ones who don't make it," Raymond said at one point, "spend all their energy on the past. They replay it. They argue with it. They try to change it by thinking about it hard enough. And the ones who do? They spend their energy on the future. The past is fixed. The future is the only variable." Daniel held that thought in the silence after Raymond went quiet. He turned it over against the past month of his own behavior. The memory work, the legal reading, the physical discipline, the careful observation of everything around him. He realized, with something like relief, that he had already been doing what Raymond described instinctively, driven by the promise he had made himself on the first night. The future was the only variable, and the future, however distant and uncertain it felt, contained one fixed point that he kept returning to like a compass needle returning north: Atlas. In the 6th month, Detective Sarah Mead came to see him. She had worked alongside Daniel for 4 years before their units diverged, and she was one of perhaps 3 people in the department whose intelligence he had never found occasion to doubt. She sat across the visitation table with her hands flat on the surface, and her expression entirely composed. The interrogation room face. The one that said she was there to work. "I believe you," she said before he could speak. "I always have." He looked at her. "I didn't testify to it at trial because my testimony would have been dismissed as loyalty, and it would have hurt your case more than helped it." A pause. "I'm saying it now because I've been looking on my own time, and I've found things that don't fit." She couldn't share specifics. The visit was monitored, and what she was doing existed in a gray area she was navigating with care. But she told him enough. She told him that the warehouse's decommissioned security system had been briefly reactivated and then deactivated again in the 48 hours surrounding the raid. She told him that the informant who had provided the tip was never formally identified in the case file, which was irregular enough to be worth pursuing. She told him that a name kept appearing at the edges of 3 separate internal investigations over the past decade. Always peripheral, never central, never charged. She wrote the name on a slip of paper, slid it under her palm, and let it drop on his side of the divider. Daniel read it in 3 seconds and let the paper fall. "Be careful," he said. "Always," she said. Then for the first time since sitting down, her composure shifted a fraction. Are you okay? Actually, he thought about the managed answer, the one that conveyed functional stability without inviting concern that neither of them could do anything useful with. Instead, he said, I think about Atlas every day. Sarah's expression changed in a way that said she understood exactly what he meant. He's okay, she said. Bryce is patient with him. He's adjusting. Something in Daniel's chest that had been pulled very tight eased by a fraction. It was the most useful thing anyone had done for him in 6 months. After she left, he sat in the holding area before being returned to his cell and thought about the name she had given him. He thought about it carefully, turning it against every fragment of memory he had been assembling for 6 months. And he felt something slot into place with the quiet, unmistakable sensation of a key turning in the right lock. He wasn't just building a memory anymore. He was building a case. The second year was harder than the first. The first year had adrenaline in it, the focused energy of immediate crisis. The second year had none of that. It was simply time, the slow accumulation of days that were identical in structure and different only in the minute variations that Daniel trained himself to notice, because noticing kept him anchored to the world. He noticed the way light moved through his window across seasons. He noticed which guards were going through something difficult by the changes in their routines. He noticed the patterns in Raymond's speech that indicated good days versus the days when 6 years was pressing harder than usual. He noticed everything available to be noticed with the disciplined attention of a detective who had always understood that truth communicated through detail and that missing detail meant missing truth. The appeals process moved with geological slowness. Marcus Fenn visited monthly, thorough, and honest about the challenges they faced. The physical evidence was well constructed. Dismantling it required finding the seam, and the seam was not yet visible in any of the angles they had tried. In the second year, Daniel began writing. Not a journal, not letters, but a document. Structured, cross-referenced, annotated. Everything he remembered about the warehouse night, dated and contextualized. Everything Sarah had told him, encoded in language that would mean nothing to a casual reader, but would be fully legible to Fenn. Everything he had learned from the legal texts about how cases like his had been constructed and how they had been undone. He wrote in a small, neat hand that fit more words per page than most people could manage. He filled notebooks. He sent them through the protected legal mail channel to Fenn, who read everything and sent back questions that pushed Daniel to go deeper, to be more specific, to find the edges of what he actually knew versus what he was inferring. It was the most disciplined intellectual work of his life, more demanding than the academy, more demanding than the field work. Because all of that had been done in freedom, with institutional support and colleagues and resources. This was being done in a 6x8 cell with a contraband pen and a notebook he had traded commissary credit to obtain. He did it anyway, every day, without exception, because the future was the only variable, and in the future, somewhere across the city, an aging Belgian Malinois was sleeping in an unfamiliar place and carrying in his perfect, uncorruptible memory the exact truth of a night that had cost them both everything. Daniel was going to get back to him. He was going to get back to him, and when he did, everything was going to be different. He had to believe that. He had chosen to believe it carefully and deliberately, not as a comfort but as a strategy. Faith in the possibility of the future was not sentimentality. It was fuel. He kept writing. In the 26th month, Raymond Okafor's conviction was overturned. The announcement came on an ordinary Tuesday, delivered by a guard with the same flat affect used for every announcement. Raymond's forensic evidence had been found to have been improperly handled at the original trial. He would be transferred within 48 hours. The block absorbed this information in its characteristic quiet. Daniel said nothing that evening, but he lay on his cot and stared at the darkness and let himself feel something he had been carefully managing for over 2 years. Not hope exactly, something more precise than hope. Proof. Raymond's release was proof that the machinery could reverse, that a wrongful conviction, however solid its architecture appeared, had structural points of failure because human beings had built it, and human beings always left traces of themselves in their constructions. 2 days later, Raymond stopped at Daniel's cell on his way out. "The variable is the future," he said. "Remember that." "I remember," Daniel said. Raymond started to turn, then stopped. "The dog," he said. "Whatever you're doing for yourself in here, do it for the dog too. Having something on the outside to do it for. It helps more than anything else." Daniel looked at him. "I know." Raymond walked out. His footsteps faded down the corridor, and Daniel turned back to his notebook and picked up his pen and kept going. The execution date was set in month 31. Marcus Fenn came in person to deliver the news, which was not how he usually operated, and the fact that he had come in person told Daniel everything he needed to know about the significance of what was being said. The standard appeals had been exhausted. The forensic challenge had not found sufficient purchase. The date was 14 weeks away. Daniel listened to all of it. He asked 3 questions, all of them procedural. Then he said, quietly, "Keep working." Fenn looked at him. "Daniel." "Keep working," Daniel said again. 14 weeks is still time. Fenn nodded slowly. He gathered his papers. At the door he paused and turned back. "Is there anything you need? Personally? Anything I can do?" Daniel thought about it for a genuine moment. "Find out where Atlas is," he said. "Find out if he's okay." Fenn came back the following week with the information. Atlas was in good health, living with Bryce Tanner, adjusting to retirement with the cautious steadiness of an animal who had survived difficult things before and had learned that new environments eventually became familiar. Daniel closed his eyes when he heard this. He held the information inside for a moment, like something warm. "Good," he said. "That's good." The final request came 6 days before the execution date. The chaplain arrived with the standard clipboard and the standard expression of carefully composed pastoral concern, and Daniel told him, without hesitation, what he wanted. "My canine partner," he said. "Atlas. I want to see him one more time." The chaplain blinked. "Your retired canine partner." 10 minutes, Daniel said. "That's all?" Word spread the way word always spread in that building, faster than any official channel, touching every person on every shift before the paperwork was even started. The reactions were predictable. Some guards thought it was strange. Some thought it was sad. One thought it was suspicious in a way he couldn't articulate but felt strongly. A few, the ones who had spent enough years watching people face final things, thought They understood it perfectly. The warden held a board meeting. Allowing a retired K9 into the execution wing was not standard. But after an hour of deliberation, he approved the request with conditions. The visit would take place in the execution chamber waiting room. Daniel would remain in restraints. The dog would be leashed and supervised by his current handler at all times. Daniel accepted the conditions without argument. Arrangements were made. Bryce Tanner was contacted. Atlas was prepared for transport. And Daniel Colt spent the 6 remaining days the same way he had spent the preceding 36 months. Present, focused, building towards something he couldn't yet fully see, but had never stopped believing was there. Atlas arrived at Lakeview Correctional Facility at 6:58 in the morning. Bryce Tanner guided him out of the transport vehicle with the careful attentiveness of someone handling something irreplaceable. The Belgian Malinois was older now, his muzzle silvered, his movements measured where they had once been lightning fast. But his amber eyes were unchanged, and the way he held himself as he set foot on the prison pavement carried the same quiet authority he had always carried, the posture of an animal who understood that his presence mattered. Bryce walked him through the processing area. Paperwork checked twice. Security protocols followed precisely. The guards in the checkpoints watched Atlas with open curiosity, the way people watch something they have heard about but never expected to see in person. Inside the holding section, Warden Gerald Holt met them with 2 senior officers and the facility's contracted psychologist, Dr. Alina Moore, who had been brought in specifically for this visit at the request of the governor's office. It was an unusual arrangement. Everything about this visit was unusual. Dr. Moore, Holt said quietly as they moved down the corridor. Observation only. You document the interaction? Nothing more? Understood, she said, notepad already open. Bryce said nothing. He was watching Atlas, who was doing something he didn't normally do in transport situations. His nose was working. Rapid, precise, systematic, drawing in the air of every corridor they passed through as if cataloging an inventory of information that the humans around him had no access to. His ears rotated independently, tracking sounds from multiple directions. His body was low and purposeful in a way that Bryce, who had worked with him for 2 years, recognized immediately. Atlas was not walking through a building. He was working. Daniel heard them before he saw them. The soft, distinctive pad of paws on institutional concrete, a sound he had not heard in over 3 years, moved through him like electricity. He was on his feet before he made the conscious decision to stand, oriented toward the door with every sense he possessed. The door opened. Bryce entered first. Then Atlas crossed the threshold. He stopped. The room held its breath. Daniel stared at his dog, this older, silvered version of the animal he had pulled from a condemned building 17 years ago, and felt something crack open in his chest with a force that he had to work very hard not to show. Atlas, he said softly. Atlas did not move toward him. His ears went back. His body lowered. The fur along his spine rose in a slow, deliberate ridge from the base of his skull to the root of his tail. A sound built in his throat, low and resonant, not a growl exactly, not a whine, something between recognition and deep alarm. Bryce tensed on the lead. Easy, boy. The guards near the door shifted their weight. The warden's expression sharpened. Dr. Moore's pen began moving across her notepad. Daniel did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, and looked at his dog with an expression of complete, focused attention. "What is it?" he said quietly. "I'm right here. What is it?" Atlas did not come to him. Instead, he began to circle. Not a casual, exploratory circle. A tight, precise, low orbit around Daniel's position. Nose skimming the air inches from Daniel's body. Eyes unblinking. Each movement controlled and purposeful. Every breath deliberate. The circle of a working dog following a scent trail that only he could detect. "He's not reacting to Colt as a threat," Dr. Moore said, almost to herself. Her voice was low and careful. "What is he reacting to?" Holt asked. "Give him a moment." Atlas completed the circle and stopped directly in front of Daniel. He lifted his nose to Daniel's left arm, then his shoulder, then the back of his neck. His breathing changed, becoming sharper and more focused. The rapid, precise inhalations of a nose in deep investigation mode. Then the ridge along his spine flattened. His ears came slowly forward. His tail, previously rigid, moved once, twice, cautiously. And Atlas sat down. Not casually, not with the loose ease of a tired dog, settling. With the precise, deliberate, military posture of a working dog giving a trained alert. Spine straight, eyes forward. Every line of his body, a single clear signal. Here, this. Pay attention to this. "That's a trained alert," Bryce said, his voice carrying an audible shift in register. "He's alerting on something." "On what?" a guard demanded. Bryce studied his dog carefully. He crouched, watching the body language with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 4 years learning to read this particular animal. Atlas was trained across multiple disciplines: narcotics, weapons, but also injury detection and biological marker identification. We used him extensively in search and rescue operations. He paused. "He's not alerting on contraband. He's alerting on something biological, something on or in Colt's body." The room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with movement. Daniel looked down at Atlas, and something began to move in him, something deep and long suppressed, a memory that had been circling the edges of his consciousness for 3 years without ever fully surfacing, beginning to approach the center. "His left shoulder," Dr. Moore said. She had moved closer, studying Atlas's body language with the focused intensity of her training. "Every time he's investigated Colt's body, he's returned to the left shoulder. He keeps coming back to it." Holt nodded slowly at the guard beside Daniel. The guard approached carefully and pulled back the collar of Daniel's prison shirt. What was revealed was visible even from across the room. An old scar, uneven at its edges, deep in the tissue. The kind of mark that is made by something that goes in quickly and is pulled out again. The kind of mark that heals without proper treatment into something rough and permanent. Not the clean line of surgery. Something older and harder. "That looks like a stab wound," the guard said quietly. Daniel stared at the scar. He had noticed it before. Of course he had. But in the chaos of his arrest, the medical examination, the processing, the sheer impossible enormity of what was happening around him, it had been documented and dismissed, attributed to the physical struggle with Marcus Webb that the prosecution had argued preceded the shooting. He had accepted that explanation because his memory of acquiring it was gone. swallowed by the concussive disruption of the blow to the back of his skull. He had never fully remembered how he got it. Until now. Because Atlas was still sitting, still alerting. His amber eyes fixed on Daniel's face with the ancient, uncorruptible certainty of a witness who had been carrying this knowledge alone for 3 years, waiting for the conditions that would allow him to speak it. And the conditions had arrived. The memory broke the surface. It came in fragments first, and then all at once, the way a photograph develops in a dark room. From nothing to suggestion to full, sharp, irreversible clarity. The warehouse. The cold that lived in the bones rather than on the skin. Rain hammering the roof and leaking through rusted holes in dark ribbons. Daniel and Atlas moving through the maze of stacked crates. Flashlight cutting the dark, every sense engaged. Atlas pulling forward suddenly, body tight with a tension that communicated urgency without sound. Daniel stopping, reading the dog, raising his weapon. Then 2 things happened simultaneously. The shadow dropping from the rafters above and the impact against the back of Daniel's skull. So sudden and so total that his vision whited out completely, and the flashlight left his hand before he knew it was gone. He went down onto one knee. Atlas erupted, teeth and momentum, and Daniel heard the sounds of contact, heard a cry of pain. He tried to get up. His hand found his weapon by reflex. And then the blade. A burning pressure entering his left shoulder from behind, deep and deliberate, accompanied by a hand gripping his collar and yanking him backward, and a voice, low and precise, directly beside his ear. "Drop it, Colt. Drop it and stay down." He didn't drop it. His training wouldn't allow it. He twisted, trying to see the face, but the blow to his skull had scrambled his equilibrium, and the floor seemed to tilt at contradictory angles. He heard a second gunshot. He heard Marcus shout something that was cut off with terrible abruptness. He heard Atlas's barking change register, from combat engagement to the specific alarm pitch the dog used when a human was critically injured. He tried to crawl toward Marcus. He heard backup arriving, distant, and then suddenly, everywhere. He heard a sound from the far end of the warehouse. Movement. Deliberate movement, not panicked, controlled. The sound of someone who knew exactly where the exit was and was using it before anyone thought to cover it. He remembered trying to shout, trying to form the words "someone else." There was someone else, but his voice was a whisper, lost in the flood of shouting and boots and flashlight beams. He remembered Atlas, even as 4 officers flooded in and grabbed for leads and weapons and the scene, still barking not at Daniel, not at the officers, but at the back door, at the exit, at the shadow that had slipped through it. And then, one face, glimpsed for less than a second through the chaos of arms and flashlights, before everything went dark. Daniel's eyes came back to the holding room. He was breathing hard, both hands pressed against his chest. Atlas was still sitting in front of him, not in the formal alert posture anymore, but pressed close, one paw touching Daniel's foot. Amber eyes watching his face with an expression that said, I know you remember now." "There was someone else in that warehouse," Daniel said. His voice was quiet and steady and entirely certain. "I was stabbed from behind. I was knocked down. There was someone else there when Marcus was shot, and they walked out the back while backup came in the front." He looked at Atlas. Ranger saw it. Atlas saw it. He was trying to tell them. He was barking at the door. Bryce stared at him. But if that's true, he's been trying to tell someone for 3 years, Daniel said. He just needed someone to listen. Atlas turned sharply. Every head in the room turned with him. The dog's entire focus had reoriented. He was no longer looking at Daniel. He was looking at the doorway, at the corridor beyond, at the guards standing in their positions along the wall. His nose worked with rapid, urgent precision. His body went rigid in a way that was entirely different from the investigative behavior he had shown around Daniel. This was accusation. He gave 2 sharp, distinct barks. His identification signal. Bryce was on his feet immediately. He's identified something in the corridor. Or someone, Dr. Moore said. Atlas moved toward the doorway with the unhurried certainty of a compass needle finding north. Bryce followed, guided by a decade of reading this animal's signals, and the warden and 2 guards moved with them into the corridor. 4 officers stood at their assigned positions along the wall. Atlas bypassed the first without slowing, bypassed the second. At the 3rd officer, a stocky 9-year veteran of the facility named Sergeant Leo Pruitt, Atlas stopped. The reaction was instantaneous and unmistakable. The ridge along his spine rose. His ears went flat. The growl that built from his chest was sustained and precise. The sound of absolute identification. Nothing like the investigative behavior he had shown in the holding room. This was not uncertainty. This was certainty. "Get that animal away from me," Pruitt said. His voice was sharp. The sharpness had a particular quality that Daniel, standing in the doorway of the holding room, recognized from 17 years of professional work. It was the sharpness of a man who knows the walls are closing and is trying to push them back through volume. "He's not confused," Bryce said, voice low. Atlas doesn't make identification errors. In 4 years working with him, he has never once given a false signal. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "You're going to trust a dog over my 9-year record at this facility." "He's not identifying your record," Daniel said from the doorway. Pruitt looked at him. Something moved in the man's eyes. Something that had no name, but that Daniel had seen before. In interrogation rooms, in courtrooms, in the faces of people who had been keeping a secret for so long that carrying it had become indistinguishable from ordinary life, until the moment it stopped being possible to carry it, and then the face couldn't quite hold itself together. "I know your voice," Daniel said quietly. "We've never met." "Not here," Daniel said. "In a warehouse, on a rainy night. You told me to drop it and stay down." A pause. "You stabbed me from behind." The corridor went very still. Atlas growled deeper, the sound vibrating in the walls. Pruitt moved. Not toward Daniel, toward the exit at the end of the corridor. His hand went to his belt in the practiced motion of someone who has reached for that position 10,000 times and trusts it as a reflex. Atlas moved faster. The Belgian Malinois cleared Bryce's grip in a single fluid motion, 70 pounds of trained muscle and 10 years of accumulated purpose, and hit Pruitt's wrist with precision that knocked the weapon loose before it was fully drawn. It clattered across the concrete floor. The guards were there in 2 seconds. 3. Pruitt going down under their combined weight. Wrists secured behind him. The handcuffs clicking in a sound that filled the corridor like a verdict. Atlas sat down. He turned his head back toward Daniel. His tail moved once, slowly, with the calm satisfaction of a mission finally completed. Daniel walked to him. He lowered himself to the floor, both hands on either side of Atlas's face, and pressed his forehead against the silver muzzle. He closed his eyes. He said nothing. There were no words adequate to the weight of this moment, and he was wise enough not to try. Atlas put his chin on Daniel's shoulder. The injured shoulder, the shoulder that carried the scar that had been waiting 3 years to be read correctly, and released a long, slow breath that seemed to carry something of what the preceding years had cost him. Leo Pruitt did not stay silent for long. The confession came in pieces over the following 2 hours, in a room with recording equipment running, and the warden and 2 state investigators and Pruitt's hastily arranged attorney, all present. It came because the alternative was worse, and because the walls had finally closed completely, and because somewhere in the machinery of a man who had made a series of decisions that had compounded over years into something monstrous, there remained a residue of the person he had been before those decisions, and that residue could not look at what was on the table and say nothing. He had not acted alone. That was the first thing he said, and it was the thread that unraveled everything. A small, informal network within the department, officers who had moved over years from procedural flexibility into something with no clean name, something that required a continuous supply of justification to maintain. They moved evidence. They shaped narratives. They ensured that investigations ended where they were supposed to end, and they had been doing it long enough that it had begun to feel like a different kind of justice. Their own kind. The kind that got results when the official kind was too slow or too limited or too bound by rules that seemed academic when you were standing in the dark with real criminals on the other side of the wall. Marcus Webb had found out. He had been careful about it, methodical, building documentation the way good detectives build documentation. Slowly and thoroughly, ensuring the case was airtight before he moved on it. He hadn't known that someone was watching him build it. The warehouse operation had been constructed. The tip had been planted by someone inside the network. The plan had been to create an incident that would resolve the problem Marcus posed while simultaneously providing the department with a narrative it could manage. Daniel's presence had been part of the design. His reputation, his record, his visible closeness with his canine partner, all of it had been incorporated into a story whose conclusion was written before the night began. The blow to Daniel's head, the blade to his shoulder, the careful positioning of bodies and evidence to ensure that when backup arrived, the scene communicated only one thing. It had worked. It had worked completely for 3 years and 2 months and 27 days. Until a retired Belgian Malinois walked into a holding room and remembered. The governor's office issued the emergency stay of execution at 9:47 in the morning. Daniel Colt was moved from the execution holding room to an administrative wing while investigators began processing the implications of Pruitt's confession. 3 additional officers were identified and placed on suspension within the hour. The Attorney General's office contacted Marks Fenn, who had been waiting by his phone since 6 in the morning, with the particular focused dread of a man who has run out of legal options but cannot stop watching. He had received the call he had stopped believing was coming. Dr. Moore's documentation of Atlas's behavior was entered into the official record alongside Bryce Tanner's expert testimony on canine identification protocols. The forensic team was dispatched to the warehouse to examine the back exit for biological trace evidence that the original investigation had not searched for, because the original investigation had been conducted by people who did not want to find it. They found it. Officer Rivera, the young guard from the night shift, was the one who delivered the news to Daniel. He came into the administrative room with his hands slightly unsteady and his expression carrying everything he didn't quite have the vocabulary for. "They've issued a stay," he said. "The execution is suspended, pending full review of new evidence." He paused. "They're saying it's a matter of when, not if, on the full overturn." Daniel sat with that for a moment. Then quietly, "Where's Atlas?" "Still in the building. Documentation process." "Can I see him?" Rivera was back with an answer in 3 minutes. Yes. They brought Atlas into the room, and this time there was no tension in his body. No investigative circling, no alert posture. He walked straight to Daniel and leaned against him with his full weight, the way he had leaned against him on 1,000 ordinary evenings before the world had rearranged itself. And Daniel sat down on the floor and put his arms around the dog and held on. Neither of them moved for a very long time. 3 weeks later, on a morning when autumn had arrived properly and the air tasted like change, Daniel Colt walked out of Lakeview Correctional Facility through the front entrance. His conviction had been formally overturned. Pruitt and 2 associates had been charged. The investigation was ongoing and would be for months, threading through the years of decisions that had accumulated into this catastrophe. None of that was resolved. None of it would be resolved quickly or cleanly. But Daniel was free. He stood outside the gate for a moment and simply breathed. The air was cold and carried the smell of wet leaves and the distant sound of the city going about its morning, entirely indifferent to the magnitude of what had just happened inside these walls. He found he didn't mind the indifference. The world didn't need to know. He knew that was enough. Bryce Tanner was waiting in the parking lot. Atlas spotted Daniel from 30 feet away, and the change in the dog's body was immediate and total. Every line of him reorienting, ears forward, that purposeful, unwavering stride beginning. Bryce unclipped the lead without being asked. Atlas covered the distance in 4 strides and hit Daniel hard enough to stagger him. Both paws on his chest, nose working at his face and neck and ears with the focused thoroughness of a complete examination. Daniel caught him. Both arms wrapped around the warm, solid, real weight of his dog and buried his face in the fur that smelled of the life they were about to resume. "Hey boy," he said. His voice was not steady. He let it be unsteady. "Hey." Bryce approached after a moment and held out a folded document. "Formal transfer of custody," he explained. "Civilian adoption, given that Daniel was no longer an officer. Pending Daniel's approval." Daniel looked down at Atlas, who looked up at him with those amber eyes that had carried the truth of one terrible night for 3 years, patiently, stubbornly, faithfully, the way only a dog carries the things that matter most. "I've always been his," Daniel said. He took the paper. A group of reporters had gathered at the gate perimeter. Cameras raised, questions overlapping. Daniel walked toward them with Atlas at his heel. No lid, no command. Just the 2 of them falling back into the synchronized rhythm they had built over 10 years and 3 years of silence, resuming as if it had never been interrupted. He stopped in front of the microphones. He looked at the cameras for a moment. 3 years ago, he said, a dog tried to tell the truth in a room full of people who weren't listening. Today he got to say it again. This time, someone listened. He paused. I don't know what that says about us, but I know what it says about him. Atlas sat beside him and looked out at the crowd with the serene, complete dignity of an animal who has done exactly what he was always going to do. Daniel put his hand on the silver head. He kept walking. There is a photograph taken that morning by a press photographer who later said it was the best picture he had ever made by accident of Daniel Colt and Atlas, walking away from the prison gate together. The prison wall visible behind them, growing smaller. The road ahead, open and empty and flooded with morning light. Atlas is not on a lead. His posture, even from behind, communicates something precise and unmistakable. He is not following Daniel. He's walking beside him. As an equal. As a partner. As the kind of companion that takes a lifetime to make, and it turns out 3 years of impossible waiting to keep. On the back of the old photograph from Daniel's belongings, the one that a nurse pressed into his hand as he was leaving, there is an inscription in his own younger handwriting. Where you go, I go. He had written it as a promise. It had become a prophecy. It had become, in the end, the most accurate description of everything that had happened. The truth was not destroyed. It was delayed. It was buried under layers of constructed evidence and institutional pressure and the particular human talent for believing what is convenient. It was buried for 3 years and 2 months and 27 days, but it had been held in safekeeping the entire time, in the nose and the memory and the amber eyes of a Belgian Malinois who had been in that warehouse, who had known from the first moment what had happened, who had tried to say it that night and every day since, who had sat in a retirement kennel across the city and waited with the patience of a creature who does not know about courts or evidence or the machinery of human justice, but knows with absolute and unshakable certainty what loyalty requires. It requires that you remember, that you carry the truth however long you're asked to carry it, that you wait for the moment when the right room and the right person and the right conditions finally align, and then you say it clearly and you don't stop saying it until someone understands. Daniel Colt got into the car with Atlas beside him. The prison disappeared behind the glass. The road opened ahead, and they went forward together into the only direction that had ever mattered. Subscribe for your lovely moment.